Everyone. My name is Lori Gagan, and welcome to MainStreetMediaUtah.com. I am your host today on the Wellness Crusaders Talk Radio Show. I will be joined today by Dr. Richard Fleming, lead contributor to 10letters.org, which we'll be talking about later on our show. Dr. Fleming is the author of Is COVID-19 a Bioweapon? A must-have book for everyone to understand how and where the deadly disease known as COVID-19 got its start. Dr. Fleming is also the author of Stop Inflammation Now, which is back in 1994. He spoke at the American Heart Association where he introduced his theory on inflammothrombotic response, what we know as inflammation. His theory became part of the cardiology textbook in 1999. His newest book, which we will be talking about at the end of our show, is Are We the Next Endangered Species? Bioweapons, Eugenics, and More. And it will be released any day. He will also be talking about the upcoming event in Las Vegas, Nevada, where he will be speaking to a group of constitutional sheriffs across the United States. Dr. Fleming's research into SARS-CoV-2 began back in January of 2020, but his research into gain of function led him back to around 1999, when the U.S. Department of Health began funding research looking at infectious diseases. My husband, Jim Gagan, and I initially met Dr. Fleming at an event called Crimes Against Humanity Tour back in October of 2021, shortly after my brother, who got COVID, was murdered at a hospital in Idaho by not being able to receive the correct medication to stop the spread of the disease. Dr. Richard Fleming has spent years graciously giving his own time in order to educate the world on the knowledge he has about COVID. But before we get started, I just want to read the Wellness Crusaders mission statement. The Wellness Crusaders internet radio show weaves together the critical and often overlooked aspects of wellness, including the crucial role of soil health. This engaging series unveils a crucial truth that the health of our soil is deeply intertwined with nutrition, climate, and the sustenance for all life on Earth. For years, the rampant use of chemical farming methods has drastically depleted essential soil nutrients, leading to a decline in plant health and our overall well-being. These podcasts emphasize that nutrient-rich, high-quality food is the foundation of our mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health. We address critical issues of our diets being deficient in essential nutrients, a problem increasingly linked to the rising mental and physical health challenges. The Wellness Crusaders not only highlight these issues, but also provide answers and solutions. Upholding the wisdom of Hippocrates, let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food. We are committed to empowering lives, inspiring wellness, and offering solutions. And we hope you will join our crusade. So the disclaimers of the show is that the listener understands that the role of a health coach is not to prescribe or assess micro and macronutrient levels, to provide healthcare, medical, or nutrition therapy services, or to diagnose, treat, or cure any disease, condition, or other physical or mental ailment of the human body. Rather, the coach is a mentor and a guide who has been trained in holistic health coaching to help clients positive, sustainable lifestyle changes. The listener understands that we are not acting in the capacity of a doctor, a licensed dietitian, a licensed nutritionist, a psychologist, or any other licensed or registered health professional, and that the advice given by the coach is not meant to take the place of advice given by these professionals. If the listener is under care of a healthcare professional or currently uses prescription medication, the client should discuss any dietary changes or potential dietary supplement use with his or her doctor and should never discontinue any prescription medication without first consulting his or her doctor. The listener also understands that the information mentioned in our talks should not be seen as medical or nursing advice and is not meant to take the place of seeing health care professionals. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Richard Fleming. Good evening, where you are, Dr. Richard Fleming, and how are you this evening?
I'm doing well, Lori. How are you?
Oh, I am doing amazing today, and I'm once again honored to introduce you and our talk today. We are hopeful that this talk results in the people of Utah and the people listening all across the world, that they will ask tougher questions with their doctors and their pharmacists prior to any further medication recommendation, any vaccines, any shots, without first asking about inflammation and root cause. Food matters, so welcome. So, our talk today, and I'm quite excited for this one. Always, when I love to talk about prion disease, myocarditis, pericarditis, all of which is known as inflammation or inflammothrombotic disease. So let's jump right in because I've got a whole list of questions to cover on the next 2 hours with you. So, can you explain to our listeners, which you are so well known for, what is inflammothrombotic disease?
Well, inflammothrombotic disease is what happens inside your body when your body's protective mechanisms recognize something coming into the body having a potentially harmful effect. And it means that there will be inflammation or swelling. That's the result of many chemicals that are released and many types of cells in the body responding. And there will be thrombosis or blood clotting, which is the effort by the body to wall off an area to keep whatever is inside, and to keep nutrients from getting into that area so that what it has been walled off can't thrive and can't get out.
Okay. So, what is cardiac amyloidosis? And does it matter when we're talking about myocarditis and pericarditis?
Right. So amyloidosis is a very specific abnormality that occurs in the heart that's due to abnormal proteins. And it is important because sometimes the drugs that you will give to somebody for treating a weakened heart, which people sometimes refer to as heart failure, although that's kind of a garbage can term. Some of those drugs or medications that are given to people actually have the exact opposite effect in patients who have amyloidosis. So, for example, a drug that's commonly used, digoxin or also lanoxin, is one of those. If you give that to somebody with amyloidosis, you can actually have some bad consequences. So, it's important to understand why the person has a cardiac or heart problem. And again, these are kind of garbage can terms, which a lot of things get thrown in. So when we talk about myocarditis. There's three types of muscle in the body. There's skeletal muscle that moves us. There's smooth muscle, which is basically in our intestinal tract that allows the food to be passed through. And there's cardiac muscle. It's a very specific type of muscle, different from every other type of muscle in the body. If something irritates the heart, a virus, a bacteria, a toxin, there was an era of time back in the 60s and 70s where there was a beer that was made in Omaha, Nebraska, had too much of a chemical in it that everybody who drank that beer ended up with a weakened or inflamed heart. So
Wow.
those types of problems can happen because of things that are added to the food, or they can be due to an infection, or whether that infection is a virus or a bacteria or a fungus. A wide variety of things can do that. And then when we look at the heart and we say it's inflamed, as because everybody just wants to use inflammation, that itis means inflammation. So you have appendicitis, it means your appendix is inflamed. You have myocarditis, it means your heart is inflamed. You have encephalitis, it means your brain is inflamed. Pericarditis means that the sac surrounding your heart is inflamed, but that's not the heart itself. That's the sac surrounding it. It doesn't tell you why, and it doesn't tell you exactly what to do. There are some basics that can be done, but to really know how to treat something, you need to know why you have the problem. And that's where we get into these, what may sound like overly sophisticated arguments or discussions, because they are critical. If you're not a nuclear cardiologist, so a cardiologist who's taken that additional training as I have for nuclear, you would not have a way to really determine if somebody has amyloidosis of the heart or a prion disease of the heart. There are some blood tests that can give an inference, but the way that this is done classically is with nuclear imaging. There are some very specific tests that can be done. There's one known as PYP, which is a pyrophosphate compound. You can do it with antimatter or PET, positron emission tomography imaging, comparing something known as FDG, which is 18-fluorodeoxyglucose, which is a type of radioactive compound. And you can see how these tracers are taken up and the areas of the heart that are actually involved. If you have too much fibrosis in the heart, you can have a restrictive problem. So it's restricting the heart from really working well. Or you can have problems where the heart is unable to just simply compensate with the muscle. So a lot of things in a garbage can term, if you will. And it's important that we focus on which one we're talking about and why you have the problem. Because as I started out with amyloidosis, if you don't know it's amyloidosis and you use conventional drugs, you may actually cause more harm to the patient than good.
Can this be hereditary?
So amyloidosis can be genetic. There are some blood tests that are done for this, and this is a very hot topic area in nuclear cardiology right now. It has been for more than a decade and a half, but in the last couple years, it's become fairly intensively studied, partially because there are some treatments that are being offered, partially because there's a new emphasis in being able to use these types of tests. But again, this is something that's been known about for a while.
Okay, and I wanted to recap last month's talk with you. We talked also about pericarditis and myocarditis, and more specifically, we talked about an angiogram. And how it came across to me is, when you have cholesterol, bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and that cholesterol is in the tissue, and an angiogram is not capable of seeing heart disease. Is that correct? Did I phrase that correctly?
So what an angiogram does is it looks at the lumen, the opening of the artery, where the blood is flowing.
Correct.
Where the blood is flowing. The early disease that builds up in the tissue, as you say, which is the wall of the artery, which has its bad effect because if the wall of the artery is not diseased, it can relax and open up that blood flow area 5 to 6 times at peak flow as it does at rest or baseline. But once you start to build up material in that wall isn't as distensible or flexible, and it can't relax and dilate or enlarge as much as it should. Most of the time, that buildup, at least in the initial phases of it, will never show up on an angiogram because it's only when the buildup, and I guess I'll put my hands like this, pushes out on the wall and then the wall can't go any further, that it then starts to push inward where the blood is flowing. And that's what the angiogram sees. But the angiograms, they began really in the 1960s. And at that point in time, we didn't have that good of an understanding. You know, it wasn't 1994 is when I came out with the theory. 19 I want to say 1989 was when Glagov published his paper in the New England Journal of Medicine with all these people that had died from massive heart attacks, myocardial infarctions, and they had completely normal appearing arteries. And that's when we first started showing people, look in the wall, in the tissue, that's where this disease is building up and it's impairing the artery from working. So I think most people, when they think of coronary artery disease, are used to thinking of like rusty pipes. And I understand that analogy, but a pipe can't relax and enhance its size. You know,
Right.
coronary arteries are the only arteries that in the human body or in any body that can do that. It's the only artery system that's able to do that. So not only is the heart a unique type of muscle, but the arteries that supply blood to the heart are unique types of arteries. And we may have talked about this before, but the equation that describes the ability of the artery to relax and increase its blood flow, the one that was done for dogs, which are different than people. The one that was done for dogs was developed by one of the men who trained me. I'm the man who wrote the equation for people. And that was based on 40% of the world data back when I was a cardiology fellow from 89 to 92.
And then you published that data. You spoke about that at the American Heart Association back in 1994. Is that correct?
Right. So I talked about some of that. I did not share the equation with people. That's intellectual property. And it's one of those things that I'm very cautious about because it is useful in artificial intelligence. And so, as we've talked about off the air several times, I have two different systems that are part of this quantification or measurement method of heart disease. And the only thing that separates these two computer systems from communicating with each other is me. And I have that equation. So I don't share that equation with other people. And I
Right.
don't share it with the computers. So these computer systems are not allowed to connect with each other. I take data from one, I analyze it, I get data that then I send to the other computer and back and forth. And that's how I have refined it over the years. But I've decided that I'm uncomfortable with the relinquishing of that equation and that ability to enhance that AI methodology because it really would allow the systems to begin exchanging data. And then I have the problem as a scientist wondering, is the data correct? I mean, one of the comments that I noticed about people with chat, was it PT or
Chat
whatever,
GPT.
and the others, when people send me something from that and they see, this is, it sounds just like you, or it sounds really fantastic. Here's the difference. None of you are asking the computer system to prove what it's saying. You're just saying it's a computer system, so it's got to be right. I, on the other hand, have to justify, I don't have to, but as a scientist, I do, the data, where it's coming from. So I find it fascinating that the human scientists, whether they're a scientist, physician like myself, or just a scientist or just a physician, we have to justify, we have to provide evidence. But on the chat systems, on the AIs, nobody's asking these computer systems to validate what they're saying. And I just find that fascinating that with everything going on, you'll hold a human to a higher standard than a computer and take the computer at its word.
Yeah, I mean, you're really correct on that. So many people that I know are using Chat GPT, but you are right. They're not asking Chat GPT to prove it like a
Right.
real scientist has to prove it. So you mentioned environmental toxins
Mhm.
as part of a cause of inflammothrombotic disease.
Mhm.
Would you say that these herbicides and pesticides and herbicides specifically for the active ingredient in Roundup known as glyphosate, one of the active ingredients, would you say that eating these type of herbicides that are being sprayed on our foods, our conventional foods, and sometimes they do have an overspray into the organic, it is better than the conventional. But would you say these environmental toxins that also contain heavy metals like aluminum and lead and cadmium and mercury, would you say that that also leads to heart issues like pericarditis, myocarditis, and inflammothrombotic disease?
Well, let me preface that by stating that my brother died because he was exposed to pesticides.
Wow.
And it was a very questionable death. That was a lot of questions about how that happened, because he did not expose himself to that. And also let me say that as a JFK kid, again, I think I've mentioned this to you before. The first night that we had projects, they sent me home with a bottle of triple distilled mercury to make a mercury vapor lamp. And this was back in
Oh,
the dark
no.
ages before the internet, right? And I took that home in my parents' basement, and I came back with a working mercury vapor lamp the next morning. So, and I've probably been exposed to more radioactive isotopes than most people deserve, with about a half-life of a star. So I'm sensitive to the fact that when you put these things in the body, they have potential toxic effects. And I think I would ask the question a little differently. I would, and it, as such, has there ever been a study that shows that adding mercury or adding aluminum or adding cobalt or adding cesium or adding these organophosphates to food have improved human health? I think
Well, we
that's
know that harms it, but
right. But see, the argument that gets into that people have is they say, well, a little bit, maybe not as much. I listened to one of the people that was proponent the vaccines for COVID, the genetic vaccines, and it was just a few months ago that I noticed this on Twitter, and I was just dumbfounded when I saw it, because I was waiting for this to happen. And the comments were, well, of course there's aluminum in here and some other things that may or may not be in there. But the argument was, but it's just a little bit, right?
right.
And the comment was, there's just a little bit of all of this stuff in the food and everything we're eating, and we are. That's not an argument that it's okay. There's a little bit of arsenic or a little bit of hemlock is just a little bit. There's never been a study that says a little bit of these things is helpful for human health. And I think that's the argument. There, instead of playing the game the way these people might want you to do it, which is, well, prove to me that it's causing harm. No, 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 no. You prove to me that it's beneficial. You're adding it to something. There should be a benefit for why you're doing it. I know why you're adding it, because it kills the insects and it kills the weeds, so it supposedly allows you to add more, get more product in the end, whether it's a fruit or a vegetable or an animal product or anything else. But you have to raise the question, and I have to, because of my bloodline and my family. I mean, we're Vikings are farmers, as one of the things we are, and my ancestors were in Iowa, and where we had 25% of the richest farmland in the world, and the raping of our farmland and the damage to, families, farm families, city families that were next to the farm families. You have to say, what was the benefit? Have we actually fed more of the world? And if we've done so, have we done so in a way that's safe for the world? I mean, one of the comments I've made in the past is the things that we've added to our food has extended the shelf life of our food, but not us.
Correct. It's like we're microdosing poison. And the sad thing is that so many people just don't even know. But thank you, and I'm sorry to hear about your brother. It's horrible. Did they do an autopsy in order to find out, like, on the pesticides? Because I know so many people are harmed by glyphosate, but how do you, I mean, besides for all the big lawsuits, the $2 billion lawsuit against Roundup and all that, I mean,
So my brother was in the military, and his body was cremated before anything could be done.
oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Oh, all right. I'm sorry. We'll move on from there. I don't want to leave you on that.
No.
On that. So if we go back to the cardiac amyloidosis, one more question that I have.
Amyloidosis.
Oh, didn't I not say that?
Amyloid.
Amyloidosis.
Amyloidosis. You'll
All
get
right.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I got it.
Okay.
Does the spike protein, does that have anything to do with the onset of that?
Yeah, that's a $64,000 question, right? As when I was growing up, now with inflation, it's more. Um, we know that there's evidence of the spike protein showing up in the heart. And the way that we know that is because you have to do a special type of staining with an antibody, and then you have horseradish peroxidase usually, which shows up brown on the tissue. So when you have that attached to the antibody and you then put it into the tissue, it will attach to the spike protein, and you can see these little brown specks. So we know it's there. We know that in the presence of spike protein, whether it's from the SARS-CoV-2 viruses, and we might as well just call them what they are, the biological viral weapons, that's what they are, or the genetic vaccines, which are not biological weapons, they are eugenics programs. And you'll get that more in the book and these lectures that I do. Those two pathways came together. So independent upon how that spike protein gets there, we know that it gears up the immune system. And when it gears up the immune system, your immune system produces an inflammatory thrombotic response. Obviously, the more spike protein there is, the more inflammatory thrombotic response you're going to have. And it's going to depend upon a lot of other factors on what your outcome is. This virus or genetic vaccines get put into your body. What percentage actually get to your heart? It's going to become variable. And I'm just going to throw this out there while I'm thinking about it. A lot of people talk about these batches being different, as if it's intentionally done. And I think that That is an erroneous thought. And I understand that people want to go there, but let me explain that when these genetic vaccines are made, they're basically running everything through tubes into a system that allows the materials to mix together, just like the cells of your body do. All right. And when those lipid nanoparticles mix together, they surround whatever else is there, like the genetic vaccines. The faster, and this only is a matter of a fraction of a second or even a second, the faster those are made, the less time there is to mix, the smaller the lipid nanoparticle will be, the less of the mRNA you will have in there. Okay, so it's not so much a matter of these batches we're going to put it in and these batches we're not. Little nuances in the speed of which these fluids are run through make major differences in just how much genetic material is in there. So it's important for people to understand that, because it's a big difference in the mindset of somebody saying, well, we're not going to put anything in this batch, we're just going to send it out empty, versus, well, just run it as fast as you can and you end up with just less of it. Or today we're going to slow it down a millisecond and you get much larger lipid nanoparticles with more genetic vaccines in it. That type of scenario is what's going on. And these milliseconds result in significant differences in how big these lipid nanoparticles are, so how much genetic vaccine they carry inside each one. And hopefully that makes sense for people. And once you wrap your brain around that, you realize they're not playing with whether they're putting the genetic vaccines in. They're just so sloppy. And we've seen this with the genetic vaccines when we've looked at them under the microscope and we've seen the extraneous material. These people jumped into it really fast. There wasn't quality control like there should have been. There's extraneous material. There's minor fluxes in this processing, but this is not like putting together a car. This is something very, very small that the faster you run it, the smaller it is, the less of the genetic vaccine it has. And we're talking milliseconds in time.
So you're basically, I mean, with that, with what you just said, on a bad day that Pfizer is adding more of it, and on a good day, maybe where Moderna is running it like it should be, the different pharmaceutical companies, the output of those batches, one could be bad on one day and one could be good on another day, and microdosing that, is that, so two different pharmaceutical companies having two different batches, one could be worse than the other.
Well, yeah, so I wouldn't say one good, one bad. It's just a matter of how much of the
never
genetic
good.
vaccine is getting inside there, okay? And one of
Got
the
it.
arguments I put up front in those books I published on Amazon called Unmasking COVID was an explanation for people in some of those other books that we saw the outcome in people with a lot of comorbidities, other health problems, having large death counts when the virus was going around, SARS-CoV-2 originally. And then I warned early on back in 2020, I said, when we should not be vaccinating healthy people or military or children, because what we were now doing was we were taking people without comorbidities and healthy immune systems, and we were saying, react. We're going to inject you, react. Make an immunologic response, an inflammothrombotic response. And what we saw was the really healthy people were the next ones who started to have problems, because they were the group now, the middle-aged group and the younger people who had healthy immune systems, nothing diverting them, and their body really mounted an immune response, because instead of seeing thousands or tens of thousands of viruses with spike proteins, we were injecting millions of these genetic sequences into them to make spike proteins. And they responded like a healthy human being should. They built massive inflammothrombotic responses here. Are you there? I don't hear you, Lori.
Oh, sorry about that.
Oh,
Looked like
okay.
Leighton had muted me, probably because
All
I was
right.
typing him a question on your new book.
Right, right,
So myocarditis, pericarditis,
right.
is it worse if someone has gotten the disease known as COVID-19 compared to someone who may have gotten 2 Moderna shots, 2 Pfizer shots, a booster or 2? Is it worse with one or the other?
Nobody knows. I mean, nobody
That's what I
has
thought.
looked at that. Nobody has looked at this, right? We do know that there have been problems. You know, the U.S. military has had, if you go to FlemingMethod.com, you go to that fourth column, there's 522 papers I've published in there. And some of those papers talk about smallpox vaccines and other vaccines that the U.S. military had to go look at the heart damage caused by smallpox vaccines. And those aren't the only vaccines. So we know when you expose somebody to even the traditional vaccines, there is an inflammothrombotic response that causes heart damage in some individuals. And it's been enough that the US military has had to look into it because Congress has told them they have to look into it. What I want to know is what happened to our Congress, right? Our Congress, and I'm not, this is independent of parties. And again, this new book, you're going to see 170 plus years of US history. It doesn't matter which political party's in the White House or running Congress. We have the same problems recurring over and over and over again. There's a big question about election integrity. And here's the question I have. If you have a completely honest ballot box so that every vote is accurately counted, nothing's wrong, nothing's left out, but the people get in there and within weeks they are captured by the military industrial complex and big pharma, do you really have election integrity? Again, this is
No.
not a democracy. I was talking to somebody about this earlier today. We live in a republic. We live in a country where we elect people to go talk for us, act on our behalf, and supposedly protect us. Within weeks, we have seen in most elections, even the best intentioned, other than Mr. Smith goes to Washington, I am hard pressed to find an elected official who has gone in there who has not somehow been capitalized. Okay? And I would argue, and I know we're probably getting off the topic here, I would argue that former President Trump has some explaining to do because he pushed forward Operation Warp Speed at, at a dangerous rate. Now, I know he wanted to come up with an answer, but I think it is behooving of him to say, ladies and gentlemen, he wasn't a scientist. He depended upon the scientist. He might have gotten some bad input. I think I would argue that he should quit worrying about people voting for him because he did Operation Warp Speed and come forward and say, you know what? I was trying to do the right thing. I was depending upon people. I might have gotten bad advice. I think we need to do the right thing to protect people. I think we need to go after things aggressively when there's a health threat or a public threat. But we also have to be aware that not everybody who is in the scientific sector was working on behalf of the people or the president of the United States.
Yeah, I think he should come out and say he was duped, you know, Dr. Fauci. I mean, all the lies that were told and from everybody else. So I definitely have to concur with you there. But let's talk about the point of entry for a virus. There's the ACE2 receptors, which so many people know about right now. But what are the other entry points on how this virus enters the human body?
So, are you talking about SARS-CoV-2? Because not every
Correct.
virus uses the ACE2 receptor. That's
Yeah, no,
just a property of this.
SARS-CoV-2.
Okay, so SARS-CoV-2 is a much more complex approach, which is the first thing that this virus does is it has a glycoprotein 120 component, which is HIV. That's part of HIV. It's not all of HIV. You know, it's kind of like saying you put the same tires on a different car. The second car doesn't now become the first car just because you move the tires over, right? So the tires got moved over, the glycoprotein 120, all right? And that's the attachment site. It swings into what's known as the NER5AC receptor. And that once that happened, it allowed the rest of the spike protein to pull itself up. And if you actually watch it, there are some very well done animations of this and some evidence that shows some flexibility of that spike protein, almost a hinged component of it. It brings the regional binding domain, the top of the spike protein, into the ACE2 receptor. And then there is a furin cleavage site that's inserted between S1 and S2. So the spike protein has two parts, S1 and S2. Probably should have said that first, but I've done that a few times. That between the S1 and S2, that furin cleavage site, that PRRA, proline, arginine, alanine, those 4 amino acids that were inserted in there, because there's no other coronavirus that has that. That then allows cleavage, and that cleavage occurs by what's known as the transmembrane protein series 2, or it's abbreviated TMPRSS2. That actually does the cleavage, which then allows the S2 part to bring the spike protein and the rest of the virus into the cell. Now, if all you've got is a spike protein, all it's bringing into the cell is that spike protein. If you've got the virus, it's bringing the rest of the virus in. There's a series of chemical reactions that occur inside the cell where the outer coat, the lipid nanoparticle of the virus, because it is, even though we call it a membrane and an envelope, it's basically made of that same type of material. And some differences that are important, but it strips that off, exposing the genetic sequences, the RNA of this virus, to the ribosomes, which are the little structures inside the cell of inside your cells, in the outer part of it, that will then take genetic code, kind of like a zipper, I guess, if you will, feeding through it, and it says which amino acids to bring together. And so it will make a lot of different parts. It will make spike protein, it will make membrane, it will make envelope, it will duplicate itself. That's called translation. And then when all the parts are there, it uses other part of our cells known as the Golgi, Golgi apparatus, to bring it all together and to make a new coat for it, which then merges with the outside of our cells and it's released. But it does this in thousands, or if you take the genetic vaccines to do it, at millions, And I only chuckle at that because it's just, when you think about this, it should be so blatantly obvious to anybody running the experiment that somebody should have said, I'm not sure that's the best thing we should be doing. But that's just me, because I'm, originally a physicist and we're idiots, right? So
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
that's the sequence.
So another question that I have, someone with a compromised immune system,
Hmm.
why, if we're seeing an uptick in myocarditis, pericarditis, is a twofold question. One, do you believe that the COVID shot has anything to do with the uptick that we are seeing with inflammothrombotic of heart disease?
Right. So in answer to that, what we have is the data. We don't have an experimental model where we've taken and injected people and then labeled everything and watched what happens. So what we have is, what are the sequence of events that occur, right? We do know from people that have had tissue samples taken from them that have been labeled, again, with that peroxidase, that brown staining horseradish peroxidase, with an antibody that attaches a spike protein. We do know from the tissue samples that were done with Burkhardt, and he's primarily the one who did it. He's now passed away, but he was really the one who did a lot of that. In Hamburg, Germany, they had this data right up front. I talked about it in presentations. I put it on that publication page of 522, where they did right up front autopsy studies of the people who died, and every one of them had inflammothrombotic disease, big time. Every one who was autopsied, who died, had this inflammothrombotic disease, and they could tag it to the virus being there. So we know from that data, that connection. You've seen a number of slides I've presented over the course of many lectures showing this same tissue level of data.
Right.
So we know it happens. We know that there's 1.2 roughly million dead Americans from COVID. We know there's roughly 1.5 to 1.6 million maimed Americans who've been vaccinated from the VAERS data. We know there's over 34,516 plus and counting vaccine deaths. With the next closest vaccine was the swine flu, not of the first go around, but of the 70s, where 52 or 53 people died. I mean, again, at 26, they started an investigation. It was either 52 or 53 died. So we're talking 53 versus 34,516. I mean, there's the disconnect for someone like me as a scientist is, I just sit there and I go, what part of this is getting by you people that and I've heard the arguments, well, it's not that many people. And you know what? It's really not.
34,000 is not that many people?
From a military objective, I calculate this in this next book, there is a 0.8% loss. And from a military perspective, these are acceptable losses.
Wow.
If you're thinking about it from a military perspective, it's encouraging for the people running the game to say 0.8%, those are acceptable losses. And we're learning. We're fine-tuning, right?
I think they forget that they're human lives that they're talking about too.
Well,
so it goes.
Yeah, but yet, from the perspective of the military, when you run these war games, acceptable losses are what yeah, it may not work for
So,
the general public.
so we go back to the question of autoimmune, your compromised immune system.
Hmm.
Why aren't the doctors, these doctors, not all of them, but why aren't these doctors and the pharmacists? Because I honestly believe they should be held accountable for the deaths, the murders, I'll say. But why are they not giving informed consent? Because people are still getting the fourth booster, the fifth booster. I mean, I don't get it. Why is that happening in your world?
In my world.
A medical doctor side of it.
Yeah, no, I get it. The reality is, there's more than one reason, and that's where you run into problems. You've got doctors who think they're giving them informed consent, right? They're of the opinion that you could die, and people have died, and we always give vaccines, and isn't that informed consent? So there's probably some of them that legitimately think they're doing informed consent, because let's be realistic. How many physicians do you think have typically ever told somebody to get vaccinated, using that as an example, and said, here's your risks, right? Yeah, you'll probably have a sore arm and you might have a fever, and that's what they
Yeah.
know. And this is probably what they're telling them with this. Yeah, you might have a sore arm and you might have a fever. Okay. Do you think that the vast majority of physicians have a clue that any of these different genetic vaccines have been a problem? I'm an allopathic
No.
doctor. I make no apologies about it. You know that. I'm very proud of the training that I received. Now, I didn't receive it at your average run of the mill College of Medicine. In fact, many of the people at the University of Iowa are hotshots in the field of immunology and vaccines. And, I frequently see the names of people who trained me attached to these documents. So I kind of have a little bit of an inside understanding of exactly who these people are, because I trained with them. They trained me. We got a huge dose. No pun intended. Sorry, folks. Now that I thought about it, of immunology when I was a medical student, right? Because we were inundated with that. Um, the typical model has been, this has diminished deaths. I'm old enough that when my siblings were in junior high and high school, and I was in elementary school, we were part of the mass vaccination. I mean, I think I still have on my left arm that circle from all the vaccines that were given to us. And we got the oral polio, and we got all the vaccines. I mean, inundated, that people weren't doing before. There is this premise that it should be a beneficial thing. It's hard to wrap your brain around that and say, I spent how much time and effort getting into medical college, and how much time and effort and money in medical training, and all the things that they put me through. And all I can tell you is the second thing that the dean of the College of University of Iowa, Dr. Eckstein, said when we entered was 90% of what we're going to teach you is wrong. We don't know what it is, but their guesstimates were based upon how the science was evolving and the errors that were being caught along the way. He was bold enough to say 90% of this is probably going to turn out to be wrong in the end. And
That's crazy.
we have to go through this process. And then he pleaded with those of us who were already scientists to please don't go into private practice. Don't make money. Spend your life trying to make this science of medicine an actual science. And I took him very seriously on that. But that was a man, and he knew what, and you'll see it in the book. He was getting big money from big pharma and from vaccine companies. And he was telling us 90% of what you're going to learn is probably wrong.
That's
Please,
crazy.
please go advance the science. And that's what you have to do. You have to accept that, okay, a lot of this stuff was put together haphazardly by people in the past. Some of it's right, some of it's wrong. Let's assume it's all wrong and require proof of what we're doing. So the University of Iowa is well known as being an academic research institution where clinicians will come up to us and say, this is how you do it. And our response is, prove it to me. Prove it to me. Prove to me that these additions of chemicals in our food are making a positive difference. Prove
So
it
I'm
to
going
me.
I'm going to put you in the hot seat right now.
So
So
I live in the hot seat, but that's okay.
medical doctor, doctors not giving informed consent, pharmacists not giving informed consent. Do you think that they should be held liable where Fauci is and Gates is and Ralph Barrett? I mean, what's the tier there? Do you
So
think they should be held liable?
the reality is the ones that we're with 10letters.org going after are the people that we know that were criminally responsible for the gain of function biological viral weapons. Okay, that's one tier of responsibility. The question is, why did the doctors, why did the pharmacists behave the way they did? You know, an event 2021 that I did in June of 2021 in Dallas, and I had those package inserts opened up on stage the first go round, and I didn't know what was in the package inserts, right? I could have looked really stupid. I'm up for that. Other people are up for that.
Cheshire.
Who talk about stupid. The reality is one of those was a pharmacist, and she was in tears, and I as she told me, I had her tell her story. She quit being a pharmacist. She spent her entire life to be a pharmacist. She thought this was the thing to do, was to be a pharmacist. That's how she would help people. But she couldn't do it because there was nothing on the package insert. It was intentionally blank, as it says, and you'll see in the book. So for doctors, I would say there's a level of there's layers of culpability here. But here's one of the points I'm making in this new book, and I want everybody to think about it. Everybody thinks about the Nuremberg Code and the Nuremberg trials as what a great success, right? We held the doctors, we held the Nazis to accountability. Do you know that those trials convicted a couple dozen high Nazis, including doctors? Russia, the United States, Britain, and France took thousands of these people out and put them into our governments and let them continue their research. Thousands. Nuremberg was not a success. We don't need a Nuremberg 2. Nuremberg 1 was bad enough. When you take a dozen or a couple dozen and you punish them, but you sequester thousands out, and that's why we're at right now, that wasn't a success. Dr. Kurt Bloom was one of those doctors at the Nuremberg trial. Thanks to the US, he was acquitted. This was a man who practiced biological weapons on the American troops and the Russian troops. He did research on genetics. He did research on anthrax. He did research on aerosolized weapons. He did research on children. But the United States got him off at Nuremberg and then brought him to the US and inserted him into our programs. Yeah.
That's crazy.
That's the truth about Nuremberg.
Wow. All right. Before we switch over to prion disease, and so much for the Hippocratic Oath on some of these doctors, first do no harm.
Look, so let me answer your question. If there are doctors that knew that they were doing harm, by doing this, they should be held criminally accountable.
Well, I think the first indication would be that the pamphlet was blank. How do you give informed consent
Look,
with
you know, the
like
vast
blank
majority,
pages in a book? It's crazy.
Lori, the vast majority of doctors, you know, there's something known as the physician desk reference. It's a massive book that is nothing but the inserts of every drug that's given. Most doctors, you know, if you read through those, I mean, there's questionable value in even reading those package inserts, because the way the data is collected, any problem that anybody has, you just simply report it. Well, you know, the illness could cause the same problems. This is a haphazardly put together book, and not a lot of data exists on drug-drug interaction. You know, which drugs can you give that cause other problems with other drugs? You know that the research I did on this virus that I published was the only peer review published, but as far as I could tell, the only national clinical trial study that looked at more than one drug in various combinations and did the statistical analysis, of which Jeff Cheshire loved to attack it, because I made everybody start at the same place, and it found that, you know, just that's not how you do it. Well, you know what, Cheshire, if you want to go do it, do your own research study, buddy.
Yeah.
Knock yourself out. But you know, that same person attacked other research that I've published. And one of those instances, Elizabeth Bick went after William Dooley and myself for work that we did out of the University of Oklahoma, where she claimed that there was a violation of HIPAA because images were used. And they tried to say that I was plagiarizing somebody else's work, but they were my images, so you couldn't get me on that. And they somehow thought that that was a violation of HIPAA, but they forgot to check some facts, which is William Dooley wrote HIPAA. And so what I got to see in the backstory that we never shared with anybody were all the university emails from where they were just shaking their heads. And so Elizabeth Bick is well known for the fact that she was the science person in charge of uBiome. And we all know what happened to uBiome. The head ended up in prison, but Elizabeth Bick got to scamper off into the dark because that's just what she does. And this little consortium of people between Cheshire and Bick and Epstein and Ivan Oransky, who's a psychiatrist who didn't get past his internship year because they didn't ask him to come back, who's never practiced as a physician, and his wife, who's a CNN producer, all of that little cluster of people have done nothing but try to raise questions about research they don't like. And my answer is that if you don't like it, go do your own research and find out what the answers are, and then come out with an intelligent response instead of trying to muck around with everybody's work and then go after people. I mean, there are people I don't like on Twitter that they have gone after their work, and in my gut instinct, because I don't like them, is to say, yeah, go after them. My gut instinct is, if these people go after you, if Cheshire and Bick and Oransky and these other people go after you, you're probably doing all right.
There you go.
What they do is they have done the exact opposite. They flip the scales. So I look at their attacks and they go, you know what? I may not have liked the people they're attacking, but because it's these folks doing the attacking, they get carte blanche for you know, I suddenly allow these people to get through because it's like, well, you know what? I'm so tired of these twits, you know, on Twitter, attacking people that they have lost any credibility in my eyes.
I agree with you on that. And that was well put. So let's just say now someone's got heart inflammation, inflammothrombotic, and now they're ready to become proactive. They want to get it together. Are there any tests that they should be doing now that they understand and they've been exposed to the truth of what has happened with the mRNA vaccine?
Yeah, so the question is how much of their heart function is impaired, right? And
Right.
and
What tests do they
why?
go out?
And
Blood
why?
tests?
Right.
Yes.
So one of the questions is, do they have amyloidosis? Do they have prion disease? And frankly, they're going to have either a PYP or a FDG study done, nuclear imaging study to look for that. If that's excluded, then we know it's not a prion effect. It's the remainder of the inflammothrombotic response, which, by the way, part of the effect of the prion disease, in addition to the malfolding of proteins, is it too causes an inflammothrombotic response because it's not supposed to be there. So the question, you just want to make sure that you know what you're dealing with. Am I dealing with a pryogenic problem or an inflammothrombotic response or both, right? So you have to get the information about prion disease. You don't get to just kind of look at them and go, well, I'm just going to treat them by whatever, right? Because that's a criticism. I would argue that the doctors that are doing that without the evidence of what they're doing, there's culpability there too. So that's one thing, the amyloidosis. The other is, what's the heart function, right? And this is important because you want to understand how bad of a problem it is. One of the papers that I published, that I was asked to do with a drug combination known as phentermine, phentermine, which were weight loss drugs,
I
because
remember
doctors were
that.
just putting people on that. So I got involved with it because this woman came into me in my clinic in Omaha and wanted to know, she'd taken these drugs, and she wanted to know if she could sue the companies and or the doctor doing it. So I said, well, let's figure out what's going on here. So we did the test, including an echocardiogram. Bounced sound waves off the heart, but we did a full echocardiogram, not these abbreviated ones. And I looked at her afterwards and I said, A, I'm sorry you took the drug combination. B, I'm glad you're here. C, there's no evidence of heart or valve damage to you. And she said, really? That's strange, because I went to another place that I won't mention, and they said there was. Now, on their echo reports, they stamped everybody who was a fen-phen patient with a big red stamp that said fen-phen. So they were looking for a problem. I said, I don't see it. So she thanked me, left the office, and a couple of days later, I got a call from Jerry Alexander, who's one of the national attorneys that was known for the fen-phen case. And he said, nobody's ever been like this before, honest with the patient. Would I do a study with him? I said, well, if first off, he wanted to know if he could send patients, have them tested. I said, I would do that if we do a study and if we publish the results, right? So we did the study. Two things happen in the study. One, the amount of damage to the heart and the valves was greater than Mayo Clinic had been reporting. So yay, more money for the attorneys going after big pharma, right? But that's not medicine. Medicine is figure out the problem, treat the problem. So I put people on medications for heart failure. And other than lipids, cholesterol and that, which I was known for with American Heart when I started my fellowship, the first thing I got known as a cardiologist for was heart failure, because I was involved with the research that was going on with phosphodiesterase inhibitors. And I actually wrote a textbook chapter as a first-year cardiology fellow, sorting it out for other doctors. So I started these patients on treatment. And guess what? The patients got better. Because, if you treat the patient, they might actually get better. Now, the attorneys that were happy with me were unhappy because that meant less profit for them. And the attorneys at the big pharma that were unhappy were now more happy because I had diminished the damage. And I thought, wow, there's the ultimate kick in the teeth of not making anybody happy. You see the patient, you figure out the problem, there's more problem than there was, but doctor, golly gee, if we use the drugs that are available, we could actually make, I don't know, the patient feel better, which I kind of thought was the goal here, right? So the point is that when these people have these problems, there are drugs that have been shown to be useful for damaged, weakened hearts, but they have research behind them as opposed to come buy my product. I want to make a mint by you buying my nonsense, right?
Right, right.
So there are drugs that are out there. And amazingly enough, the ACE2 inhibitors are some of the best drugs for heart failure because they reduce the amount of work the heart has to do to get the blood into the heart and the blood out of the heart. Both are important, by the way. And so ruling out prion disease with a nuclear study, getting an echocardiogram to evaluate the function of the heart, and then beginning treatment for that is the best way to do it. Now, sometimes steroids and those types of drugs are very useful for quelling or calming down the inflammatory thrombotic response, right? You want to bring it under control. These aren't drugs you're supposed to be using for the duration of somebody's life, although they might need to be. But it's amazing how if you go after a problem based upon evidence, science, and measured outcomes, how you can actually help the patient get better. And you know what? When I started going into medicine and I knew I was going to do research, I didn't go into it because I was going to make a lot of money. I went into it because my mother was the oldest living ulcerative colitis patient on the planet. She was actively treated for ulcerative colitis. And when she had her third child, me, they were planning to abort me up until the date that I was delivered because of the risk that it posed to my mother's health. So this was in 1956, right? So I grew up not only as a scientist, but watching my mother's health problems, going to her doctors saying, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And having them look at me puzzled and go, what? And I would think, I mean, I was in elementary school when I was beginning to do this. And I'm thinking, you know, I'm not going to articulate what I was just thinking. There's a problem here. Why aren't you people better at this? And I spent my entire life doing that. So my thought was, I'm going to help so that this type of people get the health care that they deserve, right? And nobody's
Which goes back
perfect.
to the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, and you're working.
Oh, okay, so I know you didn't want to go there, but I'll do this anyway. The Hippocratic Oath does not have the phrase "do no harm." Number one. Number two, I took the Geneva Oath, which was the one that was organized after World War II, where it was obvious that we needed to do something to step up medicine. But what the Hippocratic Oath does say is that you're supposed to be focusing on your patient. And the only people that we take our oaths to, there's only two groups of people: the people who trained us and our patients.
Patients.
People who trained us out of appreciation for them training us, and our patients. People who trained us and our patients. So in that, you don't see the federal government, you don't see the court system, you don't see attorneys, you don't see big pharma, you don't see the CDC, Health and Human Services, the American Medical Association, the World Health Organization. You don't see any of that. The people who trained us and our patients. And by the way, the people who trained us, they're in. Patients, we have to accept you. You know, it's not a gimme. You don't get to walk up and say, I'm going to be your patient. No. I have to accept you as a patient.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification on that. So let's fast forward to prion diseases. So I'm thinking that the majority of our listeners, they're being non-academic. So the answers to the questions, let's try to explain them so that they can understand. It's super important to me that they walk away with what you can explain so that they can
Sure.
comprehend it. so
Right.
that they may be able to talk with others. So I think that there is a lack of discussion out there on neurotoxicity and SARS-CoV-2. One of the reasons I think that there may be a lack of it is because neurotoxicity and SARS-CoV-2 is so complex when it comes, and you mentioned this earlier, to the topic of prion disease and prion folding. Typical symptoms of prion disease could be imbalance and incoordination, memory loss, impaired thinking, psychiatric symptoms such as anxiety or depression, which we're seeing a huge uptick in. But could it also be the case for the rise in suicide that we are seeing in teens? Because we know so many of these young kids have also received the COVID vaccine. So, can you explain prion disease and prion folding? And can it be linked to any of the symptoms
Right.
that we're seeing out there?
Right. So let's begin by doing the appropriate thing that frequently doesn't get done, and that's to recognize other people. Dr. Kevin McCarran in Japan is probably the world's expert on prion disease in animal models, in rhesus macaques. And Dr. McCann was the first person, that I heard, other than what we were doing, but he was the first one that was articulating this very well.
And we can also find that interview that we did with him on your Rumble channel.
Right.
For any
right.
of the listeners out there.
So Dr. McCarran was very big on and what I found that intrigued me first on him was he was talking about the behaviors in the streets with riots, and he was recognizing that this behavior that was occurring was very similar to the animal model of the female, I think it was a rhesus macaque that he had been able to simulate these symptoms. And so, people need to recognize, I think, the work that somebody does, and that's his bailiwick. That's his area of interest, and he needs, people need to recognize that. So that's number one. We know from the CDC data that there is a tremendous amount of priogenic disease and excess deaths with Alzheimer's associated with the phenomenon of what's been happening in the last few years. Every one of the symptoms that is occurring are consistent with prion disease that's occurring in different areas of the brain. We already talked about amyloidosis of the heart. You see heart problems. There's been amyloidosis or prion disease of the pancreas. People are developing diabetes mellitus from it. When we see the specialized areas of the brain being affected, of which you've alluded to several of those, you end up with emotional disturbances or anxiety or balance disorders or a variety of problems. And there have been well-done studies showing not only that the spike protein of this virus and the lipid nanoparticles are very well designed at crossing the protective barrier that the brain has. It's called the blood-brain barrier. That typically does a good job of protecting the brain. But lipid nanoparticles and these SARS-CoV-2 viruses are very good at getting through that blood-brain barrier. The pathology tissue and histology tissue, so pathology is your dead, histology is you're still alive, tissues that have been looked at show these spike proteins in the brain, in these areas of these individuals. The CDC has provided outstanding data on excess deaths with, I think it's roughly 120,000 so far, with Alzheimer's disease. That's a prion disease.
Wow.
Okay? So their data, I always encourage people, don't argue with your opponent if you want to consider them opponents, when they're giving you the data. Accept their data. Then we get past that argument about whether it's 120,000 or if that's 1% or 10%. This argument that I find somewhat silly. When you have 1.5 million maimed people, you don't need to have an argument. Is that 1%, 10%, or all of it? 1.5 million ought to get your attention, right? 120,000 dead in 2 years with Alzheimer's disease. Those are excess deaths above and beyond what's expected. And it's a prion disease. That's the data, not mine.
So sundowner syndrome, we're seeing a lot more data come out with that. I mean, maybe it was happening 10 years ago, who knows, environmental toxins. But now I see a lot of the blogs, I see a lot of the doctors, even Dr. Amen himself has put out an article on that. That's who I'm certified with as a brain health coach. Why the recent uptick in the information from sundowners syndrome? Because I personally know several people who now have been diagnosed with this.
Right. So we've given different names to a lot of things over the years that keep changing. I mean, there's something known as CCU psychosis, which is basically the same thing that happens. Environment, you have a lot of stimuli, you have medications in the system that cause an altered neurologic response. And in the coronary care unit, we call that CCU psychosis. In the intensive care unit, where it's a little bit different, we call it intensive care unit psychosis, right? Surgical intensive care unit, surgical intensive psychosis. Same phenomenon. The only difference is that they're not in intensive care, they're at home, where something is happening that is clearly altering the milieu of their brain so that the sensory perception of what's going on is a disconnect for the people. And a psychosis indicates this disconnect with reality, right? To a more severe extent than neuroses, So psychosis is a much more separated from reality, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist here to recognize that there have been things going on in the lives of people, whether it's the infections, whether it's genetic vaccines, whether it was locking people down, whether it was isolating. As I pointed out, back to the same question approach, there has not been a single study ever published that showed that depriving people of fluids or food or social interaction ever resulted in a better outcome of patients. Not one. Not one. And you can't, but it will not pass me. Use the argument that, well, we were worried about people becoming ill. Because I will tell you that as a physician who was there in the hospitals as a medical student when HIV hit the scenes, nobody was restricting anybody from coming in. And what some of the things that we walked into rooms and saw people doing, wow, disgusting would be one word for it. It certainly did not impact the problems that were going on. People weren't being isolated, and we were being thrown in as medical students. You would have thought that, I mean, the death rate for contracting HIV was much higher than just about anything on the planet. And in my memory, anything that's really come up since. And yet we were thrown into it, put them in there. But we didn't stop people from coming into the hospitals, just seeing them or potentially spreading it, right? So you can't give me the argument that you were worried about spreading it. as the justification against an argument that there's never been anything proven. And so I'll back it up one. When my father had his bypass operation and he did not come out of recovery in the expected amount of time, my then wife, who was pregnant with our first child, I leaned over, kissed my father on the forehead, and said, "That's a kiss from Stephanie." And my father, boom, snapped out of the coma that he was in, because that would be what you would have called it 6 hours out post bypass. Post
Wow.
bypass. That, you can't tell me that that did not have an impact, knowing that. Now, that is the type of thing that everybody who was isolated in the hospitals and nursing homes and every place else they were denied. And you can go on
Agreed.
Fleming method again, that fourth column in those 522 papers, and I've published research that shows how important that social interaction is. So you now alter all these social interactions. You alter what's going on to the health of these individuals, and you have at least the environment that would predispose people for these health problems. Again, you know me as the purest scientist. I would have to answer that question confidently, go in and start biopsying things. And I encourage you to not let me biopsy your brain. Um, and look at it under a microscope just so I'm happy. That's why we do autopsies on people, so we have that type of data. Unless, of course, you torch the bodies or don't allow people to do it, and then you basically are hiding the evidence. And I'm from old school, which is we want autopsies on patients we lose, not because we're thinking you're going to sue us. I mean, I guess you could. We want them because we want to know what happened. Because the next time we see it, we want to say, I saw this before, and this is what happened, and I now we're going to treat it like this. That's what we're thinking. That's what real scientists, real physicians think when we say we want an autopsy. It's not that we're, it's the attorneys. There's my other hat, that are thinking we're going to sue you or get money out of you. Stupid me. From a physician point of view, it's, I don't know why my patient died. I never want to see this happen again. I want to know if I can find out why my patient died so I don't lose a second patient. And I'm really bad at losing patients. I don't like that.
It's before I go on to the next question, you think that more psychiatrists would have got involved because of all the published studies out there in attachment disorders with children, the childhood trauma? We see the EMDR, and it always comes back, oh, as a child, there was some type of childhood trauma where they couldn't connect with the mother. You think that more psychiatrists would have spoke up? But I have to tell you, following COVID all the way through, from the time it started until the time we met you, was just a few short months after it started, I did not see a lot of psychiatrists, besides for Dr. Amen and all of the people who were blogging from him, kind of talking about that lack of social interaction and the lack of lockdowns, where the elderly couldn't get what you were just talking about with your dad. And to me, it's bad for the psychiatrist because most of them knew better and most of them were talking about it.
There's a lot of people that need to do a lot of real searching for answers with all of this, and I know people don't like to do that. It seems like a lot of people are very big on, oh, look at them, right? But looking at yourself can be more challenging. I I'd like to think that I am my biggest critic. Despite the garbage that I see on social media, because I don't want somebody else to figure out a flaw in my theory or a flaw in what I'm doing. I want to figure it out because, first off, I can act upon it faster. Um, and secondly, I would rather say, a mistake isn't a mistake until you refuse to admit it.
Agreed. So can someone reverse prion disease if they clean up their lifestyle. And last month we did an amazing talk on your book, Stop Inflammation Now, which is on inflammothrombotic, which I believe that should be in the household of every user and every doctor, knowing what types of food bring down inflammation. But if prion disease, does that go back to can you reverse it by doing phase 1 of your diet plan from the book Stop Inflammation Now?
Well, the classic thinking, and whether this is one of the 90% that's wrong or not, I don't know, is that once you have prion disease, that's it, right? The proteins are abnormally folded. Now, there is evidence to suggest that that can be reversed. There's also evidence to suggest that traumatic brain injury can be reversed. And that's one of the topics I've talked about along the way, which is E64D, loxostatin. There's all sorts of data showing that given to people with traumatic brain injury, I don't know, motor vehicle accidents, head wounds from anything else, sporting activities, the list is fairly long. Why aren't we giving aloxastatin to people with traumatic brain injuries, including potentially prion disease? There is evidence of disease being reversed. There are studies that show this. There's evidence that you can get some benefit on prion disease, although nobody's done really good long-term studies on this. But there is at least some initial evidence that by increasing HDL levels with niacin, that you can get a potential benefit on prion disease. Is that slowing it down? Is it stabilizing it? Is it reversing it? Well, we don't know, right? We have data that would suggest we should be looking at that. Fleming method could quantify what's going on in the brain and be used to apply treatments to it to see it. But you would want to know that. I would argue that anything that decreases that inflammothrombotic response should, at worst case scenario, try to hold it in check. But we don't know. Prion disease has been one of those things that people have not wanted to deal with. And it, it's more alarming. Again, when I was a medical student, one of the patients we had Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, depending on who's talking about it. But this prion disease, and that man was comatose for all the months he was in the hospital. He didn't eat. He wasn't even getting fluids by that token. I don't know if family members came in, but talk about risk when we were drawing blood. I frequently thought of, great, here I am. I see it now. I'm going to die from the infections from this prion, from drawing from this guy. To do anything with these blood results because he's comatose and he's not going to get better. He's going to die in this bed. I mean, sadly, there are times you have to recognize this. That's one of the few times in my life I've ever said that man is going to die, because I'm also old enough and smart enough as a physician to know I never tell somebody they're going to die or they're going to leave the hospital, because I've seen people that should have died get up and walk out, and I've seen people that should have walked out that died. But that man was going to die. Most people are comatose in a hospital bed, right? So you could take the perspective that the conventional thinking is you can't undo it. But then with all this other studies, all these other research projects going on that show benefit to Alzheimer's diseases and other priogenic diseases, I would argue that you must take the perspective that there are things that you can do to mitigate it. And who knows whether you can reverse it or not. But it's back to that amyloidosis of the heart. Everybody who came in for that study on fen-phen, the attitude was just get the study, show the damage, and that's it. But I took the perspective of, well, maybe we should treat it like we treat other people with heart failure and see if we can get a benefit. Well, maybe we should treat these people with the same approach that we treat other people, but let's do it with drugs that are proven, not drugs that somebody says, well, I think this works. Well, you know what? I think a lot of things, but without evidence to prove it, no.
That was
If you
good.
think it works, go get the evidence to prove it and do your job, because our job isn't to guess. If if you wanted to go to somebody that was guessing, you'd go to your neighbor or your aunt or your grandparents or whoever, you name it, fill in the blank. But when you go to your doctor, you think you're going to someone, and I don't care which doctor they are. By the way, if you're using that term doctor and it's treating people, it better be a medical doctor or an osteopathic doctor. It's not a PhD. But if you're going to see your physician, your presumption is they know what they're doing. Now, what we've seen way too much of is winging it. And I have a problem with that, because I think we morally and ethically have a problem when we're winging it. Because if we think we have a solution and we haven't proven it, think of all the people that won't get the benefit. And if we think we have a solution and we're wrong, think of all the people we're harming. And our job isn't to guess. If
Bingo.
that was the case, then anyway,
Bingo.
okay.
So if there's anybody out there that has any questions for Dr. Richard Fleming as we discuss pericarditis, myocarditis, and prion disease, could it be related to the spike protein? The call-in number is 385-899-2134. So Dr. Fleming, let me ask, we were talking about neurological diseases. Have you seen any of the VAERS data that would show that Pfizer, Moderna, J&J knew that these vaccines, it could result in neurological impairment diseases?
Well, I think all you have to do is go to the emergency use authorization documents, right? I mean, so number 2, 3, and 51 on that fourth column, which is Pfizer, Moderna, and Janssen, which shows how many times I've repeated these numbers. And those are the EUA documents presented to the FDA. What you will not see in those documents is any measured immune response. You won't find interferon levels. You won't see tissue necrosis factor levels. You won't see IgA antibody levels. You won't see any of that. It's not there. But the EUAs are filled with potential problems, including neurologic, right? So the EUA documents themselves tell you that all three of these genetic vaccines were associated with enough concern that they listed neurologic disease there, right? Including Bell's palsy as, seventh cranial nerve palsy, paralysis, one of the classic ones that was in there. Clearly, neurologic disease was being talked about. It's reported. Those EUAs had very little proof that the genetic vaccines work, and a lot of questions about potential harm. And if you do the math, the scientific statistical analysis of vaccinated versus unvaccinated, and you ask that magical question of, are the outcomes statistically, scientifically different? The answer was no. So no immunology data, which is important. It's a vaccine system that was being proposed. Lots of side effect problems, including neurologic, and no statistical benefit shown from the very data that they gave to the FDA, but the FDA cleared it anyway. So, you know, I'm sorry. It's time to rehaul the FDA.
I agree with you on that. So let's talk about a couple prevention strategies. And for me, I want to talk about
Well, I was
vi-
thinking about the Mars flight. I was thinking because as originally an astronaut, I was thinking that I would sign up for that because the Artemis mission to Mars sounds exciting to me. And that would get me away
oh, it could be a one-way mission,
from, oh,
however.
well, everything is sooner or later.
Yeah, well, you're not done here on the earth. So let's talk
No,
let's talk vitamin C. It's a
thank you.
powerful antioxidant. Your body does not make it. Vitamin C can act as a free radical scavenger.
Certainly one of its pathways,
What
yes.
what do you think when people have COVID, the spike protein, or they have a compromised immune system, pericarditis, myocarditis? Where does vitamin C fit in the picture of a preventative strategy?
Uh, so it depends on how you use that term preventative. Um, my perspective is not to give anybody something for the purpose of prevention from that point of view, because anything that you give to somebody, if they don't have the problem, the only thing you can see is side effects. Okay, number one. It's once you start to have an issue that you then say, now we treat. All right. I'm not a big prevention as far as I'm concerned is what you do, the foods you eat, the air you breathe, the water you drink, physical conditioning, all of that stuff, right? That's putting your body into the best mix that it can be to deal with health problems. Is there a role for vitamin C up front for that? There is, but not in the massive doses that you would want to use once you have an immune compromise or an infection. Okay? Those are two different issues. So, in the work that we originally did, we had 2 grams a day of vitamin C, right? And we had a variety of other compounds. I've given it to you. Dragon Glass, which was a formulation that I had put together that was basically, you're in a bad situation, you're going to be exposed, you have health concerns, for example, coronary artery disease, and you're trying to reverse it. Here's the fundamental foundation upon which to build, right?
Okay.
And you've seen me present at conferences data, for example, on cancer and the combined use of standard treatments for different types of cancers when coupled with higher doses of vitamin C and the augmentation or the benefit that those two things together had, right? So, one of the nice things about vitamin C is that it is water soluble. So you can't get toxic on it, right?
Right.
You when you exceed what's called tubular maximum threshold for the kidneys, the blood levels higher than what the kidneys say keep it in there, it simply dumps it out. So unlike the fat soluble vitamins, which are A, K, E, and D, which can build up in fat, brain, heart, liver, kidneys, spleen, those things, where we've seen bad consequences. You can get too many of those, too much of those for fat soluble vitamins, right? A, K, E, and D. You can get too much. They can become toxic. You can have neurologic problems. You can have vision problems. You have a lot of problems. We know that because we've seen this over many decades. And it led to the government then getting involved in areas that I'm not certain it should be involved. But when people do things that are harmful, you just encourage politicians to do things, right? Um, but the water soluble vitamins not an issue. So you really can't dump in too much vitamin C, which raises the problem of if you have a problem like an infection, like a virus or a cancer or something else, now you have to find a way to get higher doses and you have to consistently give it, you know, like 25 grams a day for some of these cancers, right? Of vitamin C. So I don't know if that answered the question, or at least the way you want it. I think it is important to know how you're taking these. Again, when we're looking at the fat soluble versus the water soluble, we've had this discussion before, which is putting things in liposomal packages, which is code for lipid nanoparticle, okay?
Right.
And putting something water soluble inside of a fat soluble container. The first thing your body either has to do is to break down that fat soluble to get to the water soluble vitamin, right?
Right.
Just like your cells have to take the lipid nanoparticles apart inside your cell for the genetic vaccines to be there, or have to take the membrane envelope of the virus apart for the SARS-CoV-2 virus to then replicate itself inside a cell. So how you get it there is also another factor. Right? Did I answer that?
That would be, so like sodium ascorbate would be better
Yeah,
than
so
ascorbic acid based on maybe the pH level of the sodium ascorbate. The one that I'm referring to is by Pure C. So,
right. So I would argue so one's an acid,
right.
ascorbic acid, right?
Yep.
And one's a salt, sodium ascorbate. There is a pH difference. And arguably because sodium ascorbate, because there is a sodium vitamin C transporter mechanism, and many of the transport mechanisms that we have across membranes are either sodium or potassium or calcium driven. You can see there's an argument for trying to have something that could utilize those receptors in the same way that the virus uses the ACE2 receptor, right?
Okay. Okay. All right. You know what? Again, anybody looking to call in to ask Dr. Fleming, we have quite a few listeners today. The phone number is 385-899-2134. But Dr. Fleming, I would like to wrap this up. So let's talk about I want to talk about your upcoming talk you're going to be doing in Las Vegas. But can you tell us a little bit first about 10letters.org?
Right. So 10letters.org is part of what we're going to talk about at this conference. This is the website that's been put together to allow people an easy method for getting actively involved, to try to hold the criminals who built the SARS-CoV-2 biological viral weapons criminally accountable for breaking the law. And I talk about the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty. I talk about 18 U.S.C. Section 175, which is a federal law, but it's also the earlier passed anti-terrorism law that was passed, which specifically addresses biological weapons. These people have violated all of these laws. And so 10letters.org is a way for you to just simply go in, www.10letters.org. And when you go there, it'll show you some information. You can go to the bottom and click build my letter. It'll give you a place to put your name and address. And if you don't want your address to be shown, or your name, there is a click hide that information. There's also a box that says both, which means you want to generate a cover letter for both your attorney general in your state and your governor, which is why it asks for your address, so that when you enter Utah, where you're at, it will generate a letter for the AG and the governor of Utah, as opposed to the one in Vermont, right? And then you will put that in, you'll continue to build the letter. just simply fill in the spaces, and when you download the letter, it will generate not only the cover letter with the indictment letter attached to it, but it will also give you labels on the first page, one for your governor and one for your attorney general. So you can take one and put it in one envelope and tape it, cut it out and tape it, or handwrite it, whatever you want to do for each one. And then there's also a place for you to click that says email friends. And if you click on that, it will open up your email, and it will have an already made out email for your friends that explains what you're doing, and you just type in their email addresses and then you send that off to them. And then they do the same thing over and over and over again. The idea is that there's enough, we hope still, if not, we've already lost, but there are enough attorney generals in the US that want to do something about it. The purpose of all the work I'm doing is to bring this forward. So 10letters.org, is for you to send in, get other people to send in, have them get other people to send in, do it again, and over and over and over again until, there's over 10,000 that have already been sent in. We need to inundate these people so that the good attorney generals say, you know what, to heck with this. I have enough evidence that the people in my state want something done about this.
Okay, so for the 10,000 people that have already, 10,000 plus, that have already sent their letters into the governor and their AG.
Do it again.
Print them out, send them again, send them to 10 friends, send them to 10 new friends, 5 old friends, but get them out there again, which brings us to the Las Vegas, Nevada event that is going on. It's the CSPOA. It's being put on by Sheriff Mackey. And it is all of the constitutional sheriffs across the United States as well. That's where you're speaking. We have General Flynn in there and Mike Lindell. We have media coming in from all over the world. But tell us a little bit about what you're going to be talking about. And I have to tell you, I'm super excited to attend this power event with you, with these constitutional sheriffs that are pissed off that there's been no indictments yet, but they're also equally as pissed off on the election fraud that's going on. So tell us a little bit about that, Dr. Fleming, and then I would like to wrap up with you telling us about the new book that you're writing.
So the presentation is essentially going to take some highlights out of the book and point out to everybody the uncomfortable truth of what's been happening in the United States since 1850. So the founding fathers came, settled the country, declared war, that's the Declaration of Independence, began their first offensive move on Christmas Eve, 1776. Prior to that, Washington was fighting a defensive war. You never win a war on defense. So he took it to the offense. One of my ancestors crossed the Delaware with Washington because Flemings don't know enough to stay home, and began the effort to stop the tyranny that they had been exposed to. A lot of people think about tyranny in the United States as being Americans owning slaves. And the truth of the matter is that every victor has always enslaved the people they defeated. And this goes back many thousands of years. And in the United States, at the same time that everybody thought we were abolishing slavery, what was really happening was we were beginning a eugenics program. And in the 1850s, between people that began capturing medicine and began the eugenics program, they were also developing and using biological weapons. Civil War, there were biological weapons that were used. They've been used for thousands of years, but we were getting much better at it. And over the course between 1850 and now, you have seen a transition that has occurred in the United States and England and other countries where we have upped the ante. every step of the way. I mean, we have now gotten to a place where we not only realized there was a problem, but we have continued that work. And that work has been funded by U.S. taxpayers and other countries, taxpayers in other countries. And so we're going to lay out the history so that these constitutional sheriffs and police officers can see what has happened, the uncomfortable truth. I frequently tell people that the book and this presentation is going to probably make you feel somewhat uncomfortable, because it is always uncomfortable to look at something that happens. But I caution people to recognize that just because the country was captured by this approach, it doesn't mean the people were captured. And it's up to the people to decide what type of country we want to allow to exist. You know, Eisenhower, when he left office, 3 days before he left office in 1961, issued a warning about the military industrial complex. He was very much aware of it. And you can see over the course of time how this has evolved so that we have government agencies, and you'll get a chance to see how the Department of Defense paid for a report on COVID-19 through Black & Veatch and Labyrinth Labs connected with Metabiota and other agencies, including questionably Hunter Biden, for a COVID report. What, $419,511, I think it was, in November 2019. I started talking about that while we were writing this book and editing this book just a week ago. I discovered that the DoD has wiped that page, wiped that website. And in the place of it, they have not only just wiped it, which they could have said, oops, somebody just hit delete, right? Like, as if that would really work. But a lot of people would think maybe that works. They inserted new information talking about those fundings having stopped in 2013. The only problem is that Fleming keeps data. That's what I was born and bred to do. The government has put big money into that, and I do it. So I have screenshots, and I have hard copies, and I have USB drives showing the discrepancy. And the last thing, by the way, that the DoD put on there for that code, and you'll see that the grant codes match, is that grant code that was labeled for a COVID report in early November 2019, they now claim was money going towards children. Now,
Wow.
I'm not saying that children could not somehow be involved with it, because there's enough missing children in this country and around the world that I don't put anything past anybody anymore. But it's one thing to delete data. It's another one to intentionally put something else in. And that is called obstruction of justice. And that is another crime.
Well, that should, I'm sure the constitutional sheriff's coming to this event. It is also open to the public.
It
And
is.
it is April 17th. It's next Wednesday. It starts at 8:30. We will have a 10 letters booth there, as well as you'll be speaking. Tell us a little bit about your new upcoming book. I hear it's a couple hundred pages only.
Well, interestingly enough, I think it's going to come out. It's slated to come out on the 18th of January. You can pre-order it now. And I guess you might want to, because I told people a couple weeks ago they should pre-order it. It was, the price has gone up. I will see probably 10 cents per book. The
That's
book
it?
is probably, that's about what it turns out to be most of the time. And I'm terrible at books selling. So the book is designed to walk you through this fundamental question of what has been happening, of what has happened in the history of mankind for thousands of years back. But it takes a very strong look beginning in the 1850s of what has really been transpiring in medicine, in weapons, and in eugenics. It tells you what happened in the United States and England. It tells you how Hitler took that. It lays out the gas chambers that you think of that Hitler thought of, we were doing in the US before Hitler ever came to power. He took our playbook, implemented it. It'll walk you through Nuremberg. It'll walk you through all the laws that have been passed, all the treaties that have been signed. It will explain treaty law to you. It would explain to you what the powers of the US Congress and President really are. It will talk about the World Health Organization, the World Health Organization Treaty. It will lay out the criminal case for indicting these people. It does all the work. There's over 700 references, because unlike some people who a lot of people who will throw out a name somewhere, and your first thought will be, well, they must know what they're talking about. They have a name. I was trained old school, which is we don't throw out a name without showing you the reference so that you know which person we're talking about, what paper we're talking about, what publication we're talking about, and you can go get it and read it. You don't have to take my word for it. Heuristic method is you can go get it, read it, and understand it for yourself. You know, throwing out a name isn't very helpful. That's like saying Fleming said. Well, I have over 500 papers that are published. So which one are you talking about? You know, you have to put your money where your mouth is, show them the papers. So they're all in there. I'm going to lay out what you can do about it. I'm going to explain about the work that I did with the Biden administration. I'm going to explain about my training through the JFK program. I'm going to explain about legislation that I'm proposing, because what I lay out in the book is not all the things that have happened, but what can be done to address it. So criminal convictions, the genetic vaccines, and legislation to require the federal government to pull itself out of healthcare and science. Because it's one thing to make an argument they shouldn't be there. That argument clearly hasn't held water, and they've continued to manipulate things that they shouldn't be there. So we need Congress to very clearly pass a law that says we will not do this. And I lay out for you why these specific components need to be given to you. And amazingly enough, it's not done at the 11th hour of the 12th month in a year as they're trying to do a budget and come out with a 20,000 page report that nobody's going to read. It lays out for you very cleanly, I think very concisely, why these things need to be done. It's even going to explain to you about the vaccine law that everybody talks about and the misconceptions that are being talked about with this vaccine law. I'm going to explain to you, I'm going to take you to the Supreme Court justices' own words and show you what they said, because that is how you deal with this vaccine law. You don't deal with it the way that people are going about it right now, because I can tell you as a lawyer, if you go after something incorrectly, the judges and the courts will simply say, well, no, sorry, that's not what's there. So,
Right.
so sorry, too bad, go home. And don't forget to let the doors slam and hit you on the way out. So it's not only the information you need to know, but it's what actions need to be done, and it walks you through it. I don't expect people to have 55 years of science, 35 to 40 years of medicine, and 10 years of law. You know, my job is to take that knowledge base, share it with you, and then explain why we need to do what we're doing and how we need to do it to get it done so it sticks. Because Nuremberg was a blithering disaster. And the people who tell me we need a Nuremberg 2 don't get it. We held a couple dozen people accountable, and we smuggled thousands of these Nazis out into the United States, Britain, France, probably Canada, Russia, other places, and then allowed them to continue to do their work.
Well, I can't wait until that book is released. I'm going to read a couple sentences from your book, Stop Inflammation Now. So, in that book, you wrote, "We weren't working together, and no one wanted to credit their colleagues with anything. So, researchers working with cholesterol ignored the work on homocysteine, and the homocysteine people ignored the work on fibrinogen. The fight to determine who was right took precedence over finding the truth." We are still seeing, Dr. Fleming, this go on post-COVID, 4+ years. Dr. Fleming, you are one of the most brilliant doctors, PhDs, researchers that I have ever met in my lifetime. Why should these doctors be using your research? And what would you like to tell those doctors who aren't following you as we wrap up today's talk?
Well, I think the reason for following it is because it's based upon science, it's based upon evidence. We're all supposed to be following the science. And despite the fact that some people like to refer to themselves as Mr. Science, I've not seen a lot of science come from Dr. Fauci. In fact, as I tell people, I would love to read papers that he actually published that were of value. The research that's been published, you know, it simply is addressing the science. And that's the best place to start. If somebody wants to add to the science, I encourage people to add to the science. That is how science is built, layer upon layer upon layer. And we have to use the information that is solid scientifically. And, science has been beaten up pretty badly because people haven't been doing the science, or they've been doing crummy science, or they've been doing whatever type of science you want to refer to the federal government is doing, which is a program that they wanted to simply lay it out the way they wanted. I mean, this is a lot of the criticism I see on Twitter are people that are simply, they know what direction they want it to go, and anybody who presents anything different than that has to be wrong. I'm reminded of Dr. Redfield's words when he was giving testimony after he had given up head of the CDC. And he said he'd always believed that this was a lab leak. And he might just be a virologist, which I thought was pretty cute. That sounded like a statement I would throw out there, which is, I'm just a virologist. I'm just a physicist, whatever. But then he got attacked by a lot of people. And he said he never expected that from science. Scientists can disagree. and we're well known for it, at least in our own particular fields. But the test of science is, will you look at what somebody else has published and then prove whether it's valid or not? And what we did in our research was to measure it quantitatively. So it wasn't I think I see somebody getting better. We knew they were getting better, and we knew why they were getting better. And I don't sell these treatments. In fact, I've posted the stuff. I'm not going to make a penny off any of it. Even Dragon Glass, which I've allowed you to post, I don't want a penny from anybody. Right? You can buy it wherever you want to. You can buy it at the most expensive place online or the cheapest place. I mean, I remember when I was taking care of patients when I was a cardiology fellow and I was at a hospital, and I listened to the nurse check out the patient. And the nurse looked at the patient with the prescriptions that I'd given, and he said, now, you can either go down here so many blocks to this pharmacy and fill this. And then he said, but if money is no matter to you, care how much you're spending, well, you just right over across the street and fill it. And I thought, well, that was pretty telling,
Right.
So if you have some, I mean, we published our data, but when I see a lot of people getting treatments right now, and they fawn, people fawn over some of the places they're getting these treatments. But here's my question. If you're taking these treatments, and you've been taking these treatments, many people now for more than a year, and you still have the problem, do you really think those treatments are helping?
Yeah, probably not.
Right?
Probably
So
not.
the reason for this, I get nothing out of this. The books I'm writing to put it together for history. That was the firm demand I had on this one. The size of this book is it has to be done by the book for the record, because this is going to stand the test of time. It's going to prove what happened, and it's going to address it. And I would think that that is who you would want to be listening to. The person who's not going to make a penny off of you. I mean, again, I'll probably make a dime
10
per book,
cents.
so knock it out. If my goal is to put the information out for everybody else to use, for the prosecutors to go after these people, for the genetic vaccines to be correctly addressed in court and in legislation, and to get the country back for the people and for the medical community and for science. Because the legislation, as I said, as I put in there, nobody's going to compensate me for the harm or damage that's been done to me or my family. And I'm over that, well past over that. But these people are continuing to harm. And the DOD's latest movement shows you they have no qualm in doing it now. So if you think that the people who built these biological viral weapons are going to go quietly into that good night, you are mistaken. They have no reason to. They have, the agenda is very clear, and I lay it out. And in addition to the book, there's QR codes that give everybody crystal clear images, and many of them color from the slides. There's over 400 slides. There is, I can give it to you because I did the numbers earlier today. There are 413 slides in addition to the book. There's 7 hours, 8 minutes, and 26 seconds of audio files explaining the slides, so you don't have to guess. There's another 3 hours, 10 minutes, and 12 seconds of video material explaining the slides and concepts, so you don't have to guess. So this is the first book that I'm aware of that takes old technology, if we're calling it that, a book, print record that is going to be there. They can't wipe it. It's going to give you QR codes to go to modern technology, the internet, on secure sites that you can't find without the QR codes, with all the slides and information and an explanation so you can follow along and understand it. So that's a reason for following something. Beth Beasel in Dallas, Texas, does a pretty good job of that when she explains that the reason for following me is I'm the man who developed the inflammothrombotic response theory. I'm the man who developed the quantitative method. I'm the man who was trained by the government. I'm the guy who's put in 55 years in physics and science, and almost 40 years in medicine, 10 years as an attorney. I'm not getting anything out of this. I can't do the attorney stuff because I intend to be there as a witness, and not just me. Kevin McCarran, Dr. Andrew Huff, Mr. Charles Rixey, Dr. Deinert, Joanna Deinert. We have military records of trained specialized forces who performed admirably until they got vaccinated and no longer can perform those tasks. We have their records. We have pharmacy records of medicines stolen and sold by hospital personnel that should have gone to the patients. We have a plethora. We have more than 10,000 documents, and I've already given my oath under oath. That DVD video that you'll be giving away to people at this conference who are intent upon going after them, and the video that's online, I'm under oath to a Texas court reporter giving testimony. All right.
I have heard that. And they can go
Go
to
ahead.
your website, FlemingMethod.com, to find out more. You can read the documents, his posting, you can look at his sworn testimony. You can find information on 10letters.org. Dr. Fleming, you give your time so graciously, and I respect that, and I'm very honored to have had this talk with you. So I wish you farewell. I'm super excited about seeing you next week, and hopefully I remember to bring the jelly. If
Preserves,
Leighton
yes.
gives it to me, yes, the jelly
Well,
preserves that our
if they
dear
don't,
friend.
if it doesn't show up, and you can mention your name here in a moment, if it doesn't show up, I know where to look.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you to Lynn Fonten. Dr. Fleming ran out of his preserves that you made, and he knew we were meeting up, and she put together and prepared some. So thank you for that. But Dr. Fleming, thank you so much, and have a rest. Have a good evening, sir.
My pleasure. We'll see you
night
in a
for
few
now.
days. Good night.